Good afternoon, Ben Hodges. Ben, it's always a pleasure to have you and to discuss topical issues related to security and defense.
Well, Martins, I'm grateful for the privilege.
Well, Ben, when we started to arrange our meeting a couple of weeks ago, the initial idea was to discuss transforming U.S. Security strategy, adopted defense concept, and what are the consequences for the Baltic states in particular. A lot has changed during the couple of last weeks, starting from, of course, Ukraine, Iran, ending up with internal developments, both in U.S. and also here in the Baltic states and Latvia in particular. I'm not sure if you recall correctly, but when we had a conversation exactly 2 years ago, recorded in Washington, D.C., regarding the Article 5 discussion that was stimulated by you, Ben, in one of your interviews to Lithuanian newspaper, the issue of the credibility, of the solidarity of the alliance is again a hot topic. Fast forward 2 years later, recent days, we had hot debate in the public discourse here in Latvia, especially regarding the book written by former Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg. Among other things, he is in one of his chapter is indicating the way of thinking or interacting with the Sergei Lavrov regarding the how to get to the table with the Russians and exclude any kind of conventional war with in Europe. It was before 2022. So basically, the idea or the discussion was regarding the buffer zones of the Baltic states. First of all, I think that would be the most one of the most topical issues to also watchers. Have you in anyhow followed this discussion? What's your reading on that before we go into the in-depth analysis regarding security issues?
Yeah, I had only seen a couple of reports about what supposedly the Secretary General had said. I think it was probably taken out of some context. There's been nobody more determined to fulfill NATO's mission than Jens Stoltenberg. So I think that I would not be alarmed by that.
But having said that, and Ben, you are like a double-hatted, if I may. So, commanding general, U.S. Army Europe forces, and on the other hand, also a part of operational defense planning within NATO, right? And taking into your position in couple of words, how would you describe how that has changed after 2014, Crimea? So Warsaw decisions in 16 regarding enhanced forward presence, and the evolvement after 2022, that was a wake-up call. Should we perceive that as a wake-up call for the NATO and especially here for the Europeans?
Well, one of the biggest changes, of course, was that most European allies finally realized that they had to look after their own defense, that they couldn't just hide behind the United States or Canada or Germany or somebody else, that every nation, in accordance with the Washington Treaty, which created NATO, in Article 3 says nations have a responsibility to defend themselves and also to be prepared to help defend others. And frankly, Latvia had not been real good at that. Lithuania, pretty good. Estonia, good. But even in the 3 Baltic countries, it was not uniformly at the front. So the fact that Rail Baltica still is not finished, I mean, that is always an indicator to me that even the 3 countries closest to Russia, along with Finland, of course, have not done everything that they should. Now, despite that, the United States, and despite all the nonsense that comes out of the White House, the fact is U.S. Army and U.S. Air Force in Europe maintain a very strong presence in the region. And I think while it is very, very dangerous and unhelpful that the American president constantly threatens to leave NATO or undermines the cohesion of NATO, the fact is the presence of U.S. military capability in Europe is as strong or stronger than it was even a few years ago. So I'm not prepared to say that all is lost. I wish the president would stop this tone that he has and quit. And also, frankly, he's much harsher against our allies than he is against Russia or even Hungary.
Agree on that. But and you definitely have connections in Pentagon, not going into the details. And here is, especially here in the Baltic states, it's a debate regarding whether it's part of the President Trump approach or it's a long-term strategy. And I'm coming back to the adopted U.S. national security strategy, Monroe Doctrine transforming to the Monroe Doctrine. Whether all of that is a long-term vision perspective with the minimized U.S. involvement in the European landscape, taking into account also potentially withdrawing U.S. troops in Europe, and in this context also having better relationship with Russia in this regard.
So, the language and the tone from the administration over the last few weeks has been the worst I've ever heard because of this catastrophic policy towards Iran. And then the administration, the president's looking to blame somebody else for this situation that he has created. And so by blasting our allies for not allowing use of bases or overflight, which is actually not true, we're able to use almost every base, with the Spanish were the main exception, obviously. But for the president to blame NATO, and so now you see in social media an increasing frustration by many Americans about NATO. What are we doing this for? They don't help us when we need them. Forget the fact that it's our fault that we were not attacked, but this is how it's being played out. And so I do worry about long-term damage to the trust and confidence that we all have in each other. And of course, this is a dream for the Russians. They didn't have to do anything, and they get a degradation of the cohesion inside NATO, which has always been the secret sauce. The fact that no matter what the problems were, there was never a doubt that we would all be there. Now, I think not everybody is so sure of that.
But is it Donald Trump? Is it G.D. Vance? Is it the overall GOP party? That is the sentiment that we are dealing with in U.S. That after 2028, the same vision, the same perspective, if it's won by this party, could be present, and shouldn't we have our plan B, alternative to such?
Absolutely. Nations should contemplate the possibility of a reduced American presence and develop capabilities to be able to defend yourself along with other NATO countries. Now, I hope that this will end up being unnecessary, because for the United States and Europe, we're not there to guard European countries. We are there for our own interest. America's biggest trading partner as a bloc is Europe. So it's in our interest that Europe is stable and secure and prosperous. And that means it has to be at peace. And so you have hundreds of thousands of Americans live and work in Europe. Almost every major business in America is in Europe. So it makes no sense to say, okay, good luck, Europe, you're on your own, because we would be screwing ourselves. And I can't understand why the president, who claims to be this great deal maker and who also claims to be the greatest businessman ever, I mean, this doesn't make any sense. Fortunately, most of the Congress, especially the older ones who have been around for a long time, understand the value of NATO for us, despite the frustrations. And I think that, you know, that back to your original point, our allies should be working as fast as you possibly can to make sure that each country's society is prepared, a whole of society, not just the military, but, are people prepared? Is your infrastructure prepared? Are women and men, populations prepared for the possibility? Do you have air defense? All of these things that are necessary to deter Russia from ever making a terrible miscalculation.
And how it's perceived from your perspective, from the Kremlin, what's going on with this administration? Because it's also a couple of unpredictabilities regarding. We saw what happened in Venezuela. One might argue that it was against also Russia, also Iran in certain point. How would you describe the relationship with Russia in any way? I mean, by themselves, the leaders, Putin, Trump, strategically. Of course, we read what's in the documents, but what your overall assessment regarding, especially when it comes to Russia?
Yeah, it's worst status of U.S.-Russian relationship I've ever seen in my life. The president has basically echoed, and also Vice President Vance constantly echoes Russian talking points when it comes to Ukraine. They put all the pressure on Ukraine. They put no pressure, no penalties on Russia. And now you've got the vice president is in Budapest trying to help Orban get reelected, which is totally inappropriate anyway. But of all people, Orban, the guy who is the most anti-Ukraine leader in Europe and inside the EU, has blocked over and over aid to Ukraine, and yet that's the guy that Trump likes the most, and so President Trump, and so I don't understand how an American president, especially from the Republican Party, can be so willing to go along with whatever Putin wants. And of course, people speculate all the time about this. I don't know. I just think that President Trump, really does not. I don't believe this is about photos or some kind of extortion. I think this is about his mentality that this is my part of the world. Vladimir, you get this part. Xi, you get this part. And he sort of sees himself as one of the big three, make the big deals, and totally anti everything that, certainly you and I grew up with, and certainly my entire life in the Army defending. He's against that.
Reverse Kissinger. It's all about China, and China, and therefore we have U.S. policy regarding Russia. And therefore, U.S. not involved so much in Ukraine, trying to disbalance the connection between Russia and China. How do you see that? Is it a military, anyhow, concern from purely military perspective? Should be concerned for the U.S. Security architecture?
Well, I think that the Chinese will have been watching very closely what's happened in the Gulf the last several weeks. And while American military power was so impressive, I was very impressed with the way that they have carried out their missions. But it was clear that we are not prepared for massive drone attacks and to deal with the kind of things that China would do against us if we got into a full-scale war with China. So I don't know that what the president is doing, if this is by design somehow trying to create an arrangement with Russia that would separate them from China. Look, Russia and China, I don't believe they're allies. They benefit from each other. Obviously, China gets a lot of oil and gas from Russia, and they don't ever want that to end. But they see a huge part of the Russian Federation actually as their territory, and they're looking to get that back one day. Nobody wants Russia as an ally. I mean, they're a corpse, but they just happen to have a lot of oil and gas. And I think that I honestly, I could be wrong, but I see zero evidence from our president that he is so clever and that he has a team that is so clever that they could pull this off.
Okay, coming to Iran. So what's next? We are recording this on 8th of April. So another 2-week deadline. The threat regarding the erasure of civilization or whatsoever. How do you read that? Is there any strategy, grand strategy, tactics, aims? How do you read right now the U.S. Policy in Iran, and what could be the next steps?
Well, if the reporting that I have seen, and probably you and your listeners have seen, is accurate, then this really is a strategic defeat for the United States. Obviously, I'm glad that whatever the reason, the president did not follow through on this unbelievable threat he gave yesterday. That would have been enormous war crimes violations, and also absolutely unnecessary. I'm glad they didn't do that. But as far as I can tell from the so-called 10 points of the agreement that the Iranians offered and that the president says we can work with it, that includes all U.S. out of bases in the region. Okay, why would he agree to that? No attacks in Lebanon or against Iranian proxies. Netanyahu has already said that's not going to happen. A end of all sanctions against Iran. So I'm trying to think, how did this enormous cost by the United States, what did it achieve? The strait was open beforehand. Now Iran is going to increase their income, and they've demonstrated that they can do this whenever they want. There were about 500 kilograms of enriched uranium material in Iran before this. There's still 500 kilograms of enriched uranium material in Iran. The regime, the names may be different, but these are still the same guys. I mean, they're younger. So what did we accomplish? Nothing, except to lose credibility with all of our allies and to demonstrate the limits of American strategic thinking.
Okay, and take into account that U.S. is still recalling the latest report by our foreign minister that the presence of U.S. in Europe is the cornerstone of the political, economic, military stability for Europe and for Latvia itself. What does it mean for our security? This approach, this method, this strategy in Iran. How should we read that from the Baltic lens?
Yeah. So, any country that is reliant on energy or other materials coming through the Strait of Hormuz is going to be vulnerable. I mean, that's not breaking news. That you always knew this. So depending on where Latvia gets its energy, where it gets its fertilizer, where it gets all the other things that came out of the Persian Gulf region, has to be reexamined. And I'm sure Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, every other country that got materials from there has already been looking at, okay, what do we do? Do we turn to the U.S. for LNG? Do you work out some other agreements with Norway, for example, or are there other solutions to address your country's requirements? But clearly, there's a vulnerability, and when you've got people that are able to use their leverage on these vulnerabilities that are not trustworthy or that are not reliable or consistent, that's a problem.
Mm. But there is also discussion here in Latvia. Should we send or proactively communicate that we could send our, well, let's be honest, very limited troops, especially when it comes to the naval dimension, in order to indicate that we are not only security consumers but security providers, and from Donald Trump perspective and his administration perspective could be perceived as a good positive sign. Would you agree on such a strategy from the Baltic states? Does it matter for Donald Trump such actions?
I think that that's something that I'm uneasy addressing, because this is a decision that Latvian government would have to make. I don't think that, to be honest, despite the courage and professional competence of men and women of Latvian armed forces, that's not going to make a difference in the Strait of Hormuz. And Trump has made it clear that he does not, I would not expect a big return on that investment. Mm-hmm. Instead, I think European countries could say, hey, look, U.S., we know you're overstretched. We will take on more and more responsibility in Europe. We will not resist if you want to pull out whatever. But I don't know that that would be the best investment of Latvian resources. Maybe there's something that could be done, but honestly, I don't know what. I mean, economically, politically, yes, but dealing with Ukraine and dealing with deterrence against Russia has to be the priority, I think, for European countries, and reducing the need for American presence in Europe. These are the kind of things I think where, Europe is a superpower. Mm-hmm. I mean, come on.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of Ukraine, exactly, that is definitely our focus and one of our main priority. How do you see the developments in Ukraine? There are already speculations that take into account that Ukrainians are asking for security guarantees. Real security guarantees, also and mainly by the United States of America, that we are here in still long-term perspective, in a long-term rivalry, even leading up to the 2028, because U.S. involvement in such a peace settlement is crucial, and obviously from Ukrainian perspective. How you assess what's going on in Ukraine, also within the context of Iran?
Well, it's clear that Russia cannot defeat Ukraine. I mean, that's been clear for some time, and it's really become even more clear now that the idea that Russian victory is inevitable, that's obviously not happening. I mean, the Ukrainians, with all credit to what they've done, both in terms of reversing the casualty rates and where they're killing more Russians than Russia can recruit. Their long-range strikes against Russia's oil and gas infrastructure, to me, is brilliant. I mean, that's the path to victory for them, is making it impossible for Russia to export oil and gas. And so the Great Black Sea Fleet is not a factor in the Black Sea anymore. And so I think if nations were able to do more in the Baltic Sea to make sure that none of these shadow fleet vessels were getting out, keep doing that. Um, I think that Ukraine is actually uh, their strategic position improves by the day. We just got through a terrible winter. I have a very dear friend who's a Ukrainian officer, and I talked to him recently, about a month and a half ago. I said, "So how's it going? How's your family?" He said, "Well, they live in Kiev, and it's 7 degrees in their apartment, inside their apartment, 7 degrees." I said, "Holy hell!" But then he says, "But it'll be springtime in just a few weeks." I mean, that's the attitude, and so I think the, the best guarantee for Ukrainian security is that they become like Finland or they become like Israel, that they have a very, very good defense industry. They have they develop a very good reservist system where thousands of people can be mobilized very quickly. Um, and the GUR becomes like the Mossad, and they are out tracking down these Russian war criminals, and um, but so that these people, the ones who are responsible for the bombing of civilian targets and the kidnapping of children, they for the rest of their life they should be looking under their car and over their shoulder. That's going to be the best guarantee for Ukraine, and all of us are going to be hiding behind them.
But without U.S. financial military aid, the
Well, I
the
mean,
last big package was already two years ago, right?
yeah,
60
I
billion.
mean, the best year of the war for them was after Trump came in and pretty much stopped most of what we were doing. Now, there may be some intelligence that's still being provided. I don't know. Um, but Europe is not without capability.
Mm.
You've got most of the richest countries on the planet, and to provide some of the intelligence that's needed, certain capabilities. These are political choices by European countries. This is not a lack of capability, it's a lack of political will.
Exactly. And about Europe and Baltic states. So how would you assess? Have we developed? Of course, we wanted a bit rapid, more rapid, right, development. But taking into account the changing approach, mindset, one might argue, within European allies, but also here in the Baltic states, how would you assess the security situation in Europe, in particular here in the Baltic states?
Well, Martins, I'm going to say something that you already know, which is the best way to defend Europe against Russia is to make sure that Ukraine is successful. I mean, that's that's an easy answer. Make sure Ukraine wins, and then you won't have to worry about Russian troops
Mhm.
invading in Latvia or Estonia or anywhere else, other than the gray zone operations that they're already doing. Um, so that would be for me the first priority. And then secondly, when I look at the quality of women and men I've met from Latvia, for example, as well as in the other armed forces of our allies, I mean, it's good quality. It's just not a lot of quantity. But you don't have to have 300,000 or 500,000 troops in the Baltic states. What you do need, though, is the ability to defend infrastructure, and you need societies that are prepared. Um, I think, people in Latvia should recognize that in a worst case scenario, worst case, where we were all caught completely by surprise by a large scale Russian attack. It could be maybe 2 weeks before additional forces arrived from Germany or Poland up into Latvia. I don't know that it would be 2 weeks, but when I think about if you had to do this without warning,
Mhm.
cold start, worst case,
Mhm.
that's not unrealistic expectations. So that means that Latvia and Estonia and Lithuania would need to be able to not only for their forces to slow down Russians in the early days, but also you would have to have infrastructure that could survive Russian attacks, whether it was cyber or Shahed drones or any other weapons, and the people mentally prepared, just like Ukrainians. Um, And that means that the civilian leadership has to be honest with the population and talk about, what the possibilities are. And so that people become like, all right, we're not giving up. This is too valuable. And I think that all the Latvians I know, they are capable of doing that if they believe that their civilian leadership is being honest with them. And I think how you deal with gray zone operations is a part of this. Whether it's drones landing in Latvia for whatever reason, or other disruptions to rail or power infrastructure, misinformation. If you don't do something about it, then it only continues. And of course, we call it gray zone operations because there's not a big Russian flag on it, but everybody knows who it is. Do something about that. Start finding a way to inflict consequences on the Russians when they do this.
Well, you mentioned very important, starting to answer to this question regarding that the Ukrainians are holding the front line or fighting our war. That is, well, still, I think the vast majority of the society believes that. And there is concerns, and coming to the concluding of our conversation, there is concerns that a couple of drones entering our or violating our airspace, or some messaging also from the Washington, and also contributed by information operations, disinformation operations here in the Baltic state region coming from Kremlin. What is your main, so to say, argument why Russia cannot open the second strategic front right now? Whether it's quantity or there is any other reason regarding that?
Well, I will not say that they couldn't, but you would have to ask. So, what would be the objective if they decided to attack into Daugavpils, for example, or up near Narva, or something like that? For what purpose? I mean, what would that achieve? I think the purpose of such an attack would not be to conquer all of Europe, which is what they wanted during the Cold War, but it would be to create a situation where to prove that other countries would not respond and therefore lead to the breakup of NATO. That would be the objective. And so to do that, you wouldn't have to have an attack that would go all the way into Germany, for example, or to Norway. But then, if they did such a blatant thing, I think it would be very difficult for, a lot of nations would have to start recalculating their belief that they could just avoid getting involved.
Mm.
And I think actually most nations, even if the U.S. appears to be unreliable right now, I think most nations would, in fact, live up to their obligation. I'm impressed with what I see from the JEF, this collection of Baltic and Scandinavian countries and the UK. These are all nations that have real capability, that are determined and ready. And I would expect a strong response from all of them, even if it was not a NATO response. And look, I'm still, even despite all the nonsense that comes from the White House and the weakness of Secretary Rubio and the bizarreness of our Secretary of Defense, most Americans know that NATO is in our interest, and that I think I would fully. I mean, we have troops there. They're there, and so. I would expect the United States would do its duty also.
So the future, the last one, the future of the U.S. within NATO? This administration, of course, the speculations after 2028, but this one?
Well, remind your listeners that this is not something new, that there have been talk from the 50s about, if we still have so many troops in Europe, then NATO is a failure. Why are we doing this? I mean, this constantly comes up over and over and over. And it's understandable why it comes up, especially when Americans, after the Cold War, they look and see so many European countries that have, frankly, very good social networks, systems, but they do that by not paying a lot for defense. And so you could understand why some people in the U.S. would be a little bit annoyed with this.
Mm. Well, thank you, Ben. It's a pleasure time to time to speak with you and to hear also from very high former general that was dealing with European issues from American perspective, how you see and what could be the consequences. So there are a lot of homeworks to be done nationally, but also, as you know, sometimes you are calling like a Baltic state, small states, but we have a say. I mean, that
Yes,
could be remembered
exactly.
actually, that we are leading by example when it comes to for instance, going to 5% of GDP or helping Ukraine proportionally to our GDP.
Right. Yeah. Latvia is not without agency. And look, I would encourage all of my European friends, take a long-term view of this. Okay. Don't give up on us right now. We have midterm elections in November. I think this is going to be a significant election that will change a lot of things. But democracy is not ballet. You know, it is hard, and so we're in a real fight in America right now, and we need Europe just like Europe needs the United States.
Perfect concluding remark. Thank you, Ben.